I'm Mehul Mankad, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at the Duke University School of Medicine and a staff psychiatrist at the Durham VA Medical Center. I'll be the host for a number of modules in which we'll be working with you, the Veteran Service Officer, to increase your fund of knowledge so that you can more effectively help the veterans that you serve across the state of North Carolina each and every day. So here's a medical definition of trauma: exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. The person experiencing the trauma has to directly experience the trauma. I'll give you an example. Let's say they're in a convoy of vehicles and their truck is hit with an IED blast. That can be a reason for them to have a psychological trauma. Another example would be if they're in a convoy of vehicles and the truck ahead of them is hit with an IED blast and they witness somebody else getting injured. That can be an example for a psychological trauma. A third example could be if they learned about the trauma happening to a close friend or a family member. Now that trauma has to be sudden and unexpected and violent. And so, for example, let's say they are truck drivers in the military and they were not out on a convoy, but their unit member was, that they had swapped shifts or something like that. And that person was injured in an IED blast. Now, our veteran was not there. They did not see the injury. They did not witness it. But this was a close friend, and it was sudden, unexpected, and violent. That could count as a psychological trauma. The fourth possibility is if they experienced the details of trauma even though they were not there to personally witness the trauma. An example of that would be a combat medic who's working on the same base and is receiving wounded from all of these IED blasts. They did not witness the person get injured, but they are seeing the details of what happens when people are traumatized. Unfortunately, trauma is common, and it happens in life commonly for our active duty service members. About 60% of men and 50% of women who are in the military will report trauma that meets these psychological standards we talked about at some point in their lives. Men are more likely to experience combat, to go through physical assault, occupational hazards, or witness some other death or injury. Women are more likely to experience sexual assault. But these are likelihoods, they're not absolutes. The only silver lining to these numbers is that most people who go through a trauma do not develop PTSD. So there's a variety of experiences that can lead to a trauma. They can include combat, community violence. And you think, well, community violence, what does that have to do with the military? Well, you know, if your MOS was military police or you were involved in some sort of peacekeeping operation, there could be a lot of exposure to community violence, even for veterans who served during peacetime. Sexual trauma, domestic violence, natural disasters, exposure to acts of terrorism, and traumas that can occur in childhood, such as physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. Sometimes you'll hear a word thrown around called complex trauma or a related diagnosis called complex PTSD. We're still learning a lot about these different subtypes of PTSD, but let's talk a little bit about complex trauma. In some traumatic experiences, there was one event. So an example would be an exposure to a specific natural disaster, a tornado. It comes through, you know, it wipes out part of a town, but then it goes on and it's gone, right? Or a hurricane or something like that. Or an exposure to a very specific IED blast for someone who's stationed in an active zone. In other circumstances, the individual was exposed for prolonged periods of time to a traumatic environment. And so you think of someone who might be serving in an infantry capacity for an entire tour of duty or multiple tours where there are multiple events that would meet criteria for a psychological trauma. And what we're trying to understand is the PTSD that someone might develop from point trauma different from the PTSD that somebody might develop from a complex and lengthy exposure to many traumas. Let's say someone is exposed to a traumatic event and the doctors say they don't have PTSD. Are they going to be okay? The very difficult thing to understand about people's reactions to trauma is that the traumatic event is an objective event. It happened, but their reaction to trauma is subjective. So let me give you an example. Let's say there was a hurricane and it hit the eastern seaboard of the United States and National Guard troops are deployed to help. A multiple variety of things could happen to the service members that go to that situation and are in that mission. One is that they could be exposed to the ravages of this hurricane and see what happens to the people and experience what we would all agree is a psychologically traumatic experience, and then they could be okay. They could get by and go back to functioning, be deactivated, go on with their jobs and families, and be just fine. If somebody asked them about their service during the hurricane, they may talk about it, they may not. So that's one possibility. Of course, we know the other possibility. They go and serve in that area, and they're affected, and it gets them down. They either develop PTSD or they develop some other psychological distress. So that's the other possibility. There's also the possibility that they could have something in between. So they're not completely okay, but they don't have a full-blown psychological disorder. It's absolutely true that the death of a loved one affects people in a variety of ways. People's reactions to the loss of a parent, a spouse, a child, or a close friend can have a major effect on that person's ability to function. However, most of these sorts of losses are not considered unexpected. And that's the piece that we need to remember with trauma. Traumas are sudden and unexpected, usually. For better or worse, the way that mental health folks look at things like the death of a loved one is that it's usually thought about in terms of grief and bereavement. Grief is a natural reaction to the expected death of a loved one. That is absolutely an important life event. However, it is not an unexpected one, and so it would not be considered a trauma. We do know that you can experience trauma as a child and develop childhood PTSD, and that can last into adulthood. So there are individuals who have entered the military that have PTSD from something horrible that happened in their childhood. You might have met service members who enlisted in the military to escape a bad situation from their childhood, or you might have met military service members who are driven by a sense of duty and commitment to prevent the trauma that they experienced from happening to others. What we do know is that if somebody experienced a childhood trauma, but they didn't get PTSD from it, they're still very vulnerable, and in fact more vulnerable to developing PTSD as an adult. A large number of people who experience a traumatic event, whether it's combat or something else, have an immediate reaction in the days or weeks following the event. The medical community uses the term acute to describe something that is sudden and short-lived. And so there's this diagnosis called acute stress disorder. And that is really used for people that have symptoms that look a lot like PTSD, but they happen as soon as the trauma hits them. If the symptoms of acute stress disorder last for more than a month, then we start to think, well, gosh, maybe this person may have PTSD. The wonderful thing is, most people who develop acute stress disorder symptoms right after a trauma recover from it. So what are these symptoms that we're talking about? They might have difficulty sleeping. They might have nightmares. They might have irritability. They might avoid things. You know, the challenge is that a blast injury or some other closed head injury that occurs at the time of the psychological trauma sure can have a lot of symptoms that overlap with acute stress disorder or can overlap with PTSD as it develops. As many as half of people who experience a trauma develop acute stress symptoms, but around a quarter of people who experience that trauma go on to develop PTSD. The number of veterans who have symptoms of PTSD at any given time ranges between 10 to 15% of all American veterans. About 30% of veterans will report PTSD symptoms at some point in their life. So let me go over that one more time. At any given point, 10 to 15% of American veterans are reporting PTSD symptoms right now, but over their lifetime, about 30% of veterans will report some PTSD symptoms. The amazing thing about post-traumatic stress disorder and other trauma reactions is that they are acquired conditions. You're not born with them. It wasn't your fault. It might help to think about three elements that go into the development of any psychological disorder. Number one, you are born with some genetic predispositions. You inherit 50% of your genes from your mother, 50% of your genes from your father, and your brain and body are susceptible to different insults and injuries than the person next to you. So the same thing that you both experience, whether it's a psychological trauma or a physical one, are going to affect two people differently. So that's the biology. Number two, we are a combination of all the memories, experiences, and psychological things that have happened to us up to the point of that trauma. So some people have more psychological resilience, some people have more psychological vulnerability. Number three, your interaction with society. There are elements that are beyond your control, whether it's your relationship with your employer, your relationship with your significant other, possibly your housing situation, your financial situation, your culture. All of these things are societal influences that can make you either more resilient or more vulnerable to developing PTSD.